click to subscribe. I've got some breaking news. It's kind of a last-minute episode that I'm throwing together because of this information that I've been able to confirm.
Subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell. Turn on every
Checking out my show. I really appreciate it. There are some new developments in the Nancy Guthrie.
For the past several months, many of us have been closely following the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. The initial timeline provided by law enforcement seems straightforward, if deeply unsettling to the local community. According to early press releases, Nancy was taken from her home on the evening of Sunday, October 12, 2025. Within 48 hours, investigators identified a primary suspect, a 42-year-old man named Robert Vance, who was subsequently tracked down and arrested at a roadside motel just outside of Las Vegas, Nevada. At the time, authorities assured the public that Vance had acted entirely alone, framing the entire kidnapping as an isolated, random act of opportunity. For weeks, that was the narrative presented at press briefings and echoed across local news broadcasts. It was a neat, rapid conclusion to a terrifying event, suggesting to the neighborhood that the immediate danger had been fully contained. But there is a major problem with that version of events. On June 22, 2026, investigative journalist Brian Entin broke a piece of news that fundamentally changes everything we thought we knew about this case. According to federal court documents obtained by Entin, a 61-year-old woman named Martha Albright was quietly taken into custody by federal marshals at a residential property in Mesa, Arizona. The formal charging documents explicitly connect Albright to Robert Vance, alleging that she provided critical material and logistical assistance both before and after Nancy Guthrie was taken from her residence. This legal development completely contradicts the initial assurances from local law enforcement that Vance operated as a lone wolf. If the state's new allegations are accurate, the abduction of Nancy Guthrie was not a spontaneous crime committed by one desperate individual. Instead, it appears to involve a coordinated effort that stretched directly across state lines, utilizing properties and mobile resources that Vance could not have accessed on his own. To understand how we arrived at this turning point, we have to look closely at the first major piece of evidence that brought investigators to Martha Albright's front door in Arizona. That evidence begins with a distinct financial paper trail left behind in the days immediately leading up to October 12. According to financial ledgers entered into the public record yesterday, Robert Vance's personal bank accounts were entirely depleted by the end of September 2025. Certified records show he had no steady stream of income, and his credit cards were completely maxed out. Yet exactly 3 days before the kidnapping, on October 9th, a cashier's check in the amount of $5,000 was deposited into Vance's account at a Wells Fargo branch in Henderson, Nevada. Investigators successfully tracked the source of that specific check back to a primary bank account registered to Martha Albright in Mesa. Before we look at the specific documents that broke this case wide open, I would like to invite you to join our community here. If you appreciate true crime coverage that focuses on real facts, verifiable documents, and careful storytelling without the usual sensationalism, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel right now. As we go through these details today, I also want you to keep one central question in mind. How is it that a 61-year-old woman with absolutely no prior criminal record suddenly becomes the alleged logistical anchor for a federal kidnapping case? I would love to read your thoughts on that as the evidence unfolds, so please feel free to leave a comment as we move through the timeline together. Now here's where things get complicated. When initially questioned by local detectives via a telephone call shortly after Vance's arrest in October, Albright claimed she had not spoken to Vance in several years. She stated to officers that Vance was merely a distant acquaintance of her late husband, and she denied any knowledge of his recent financial struggles or his physical whereabouts. Because she was living over 300 miles away in Arizona, and because local police were focused heavily on processing the physical evidence found inside Vance's Nevada motel room, her statement was accepted at face value for nearly 8 months. But investigators say that an analysis of cellular data tells a completely different story. Federal authorities recently completed a forensic download of Robert Vance's primary mobile phone, which was recovered from his vehicle at the time of his arrest. The data revealed that during the week of October 5th, Vance and Albright exchanged 42 separate text messages. More importantly, log files from cell towers indicate that on the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared, a burner phone registered under a fictitious name but paid for using a credit card belonging directly to Martha Albright, was active and pinging off a tower less than 2 miles from the Guthrie residence. This digital footprint places Albright's property, or at least a device she actively funded, in direct proximity to the crime scene at the exact time the abduction occurred. According to the federal arrest warrant, this burner phone remained in constant communication with Vance's primary device as he traveled east toward the Arizona border. Then there's this detail, which moved the case from a digital trace to a physical reality. When federal marshals executed a search warrant at Albright's home on Main Street in Mesa on Monday morning, they were searching for the physical mobile device associated with those pings. What they discovered inside the residence, however, went far beyond a single phone. According to reports from the scene, investigators recovered a handwritten notebook hidden inside a desk drawer in Albright's living room. The notebook contained detailed logs of Nancy Guthrie's daily routine, including the specific time she left her house to walk her dog, the license plate numbers of vehicles frequently parked in her driveway, and handwritten notes regarding the layout of her neighborhood. The handwriting in the notebook is currently undergoing forensic analysis to determine if it matches Albright's writing or if it belongs entirely to Robert Vance. But the physical evidence did not stop with the notebook. Neighbors near the Guthrie home had previously reported seeing a dark gray sedan with out-of-state license plates idling near the intersection of Elm Street and Oak Avenue in the days preceding October 12. At the time, local police dismissed these sightings as unrelated neighborhood traffic. However, during the Monday morning raid in Arizona, a dark gray 2018 Chevrolet Malibu matching that exact description was found parked inside Albright's garage. The vehicle is registered directly to Martha Albright. This brings us to a critical crossroads in the investigation. We are no longer looking at a simple case of a single individual committing a random act of violence. The presence of the vehicle, the financial transactions, the cell phone tower data, and the surveillance notes found in Mesa all point toward a calculated operation. What remains entirely unclear is the motive connecting Martha Albright to Nancy Guthrie. Public records show no overlapping employment history, no shared property ownership, and no mutual relatives between the two women. Albright is a retired administrative assistant with no prior criminal record, making her sudden involvement in a federal kidnapping case highly unusual. As of this evening, Martha Albright remains held without bond at the Maricopa County Jail, awaiting extradition to face formal federal conspiracy charges. Her defense attorney has issued a brief statement maintaining her innocence, suggesting that Albright was manipulated by Vance and had no knowledge of what the funds or the vehicle were being used for. With this new piece of evidence established, the entire timeline of the Nancy Guthrie case must be re-examined. As the focus of the investigation expands into Arizona, detectives have begun a granular review of the digital and physical evidence seized from Martha Albright's residence. What they are finding is starting to paint a far more calculated picture than a simple case of an acquaintance helping a friend. According to sources close to the federal task force, a deep forensic dive into the 2018 Chevrolet Malibu found in Albright's garage revealed that its built-in navigation system had been manually cleared of all location history on October 14th, just 2 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Investigators say that while the user-facing history was deleted, the vehicle's internal computer logs retained background telematics data. That data indicates the vehicle was driven from Mesa to Tucson on October 11th, where it sat idling for several hours near the Catalina Foothills neighborhood before returning to Mesa in the early morning hours of October 12. But there is a problem with the timeline that Albright's defense attorney has put forward. Her legal team maintains that Albright lent her vehicle to Robert Vance under the impression that he needed it to travel to a job interview. However, toll booth camera footage captured on Interstate 10 outside of Phoenix on the morning of October 11 shows a woman matching Albright's description behind the wheel, wearing a distinctive wide-brimmed straw hat. A hat matching that exact description was photographed by federal agents sitting on the kitchen counter during Monday's raid. This puts Albright physically in the area of the surveillance operations prior to the kidnapping, completely undermining the claim that she was an unwitting participant operating from a distance. To make sense of these mounting contradictions, investigators consulted with Dr. Aris Vaughn, a former FBI behavioral analyst who specializes in multi-perpetrator abductions. According to Dr. Vaughn, random, spontaneous kidnappings rarely involve this level of geographic division or financial preparation. When reviewing the public filings on Albright's cell phone data and financial transactions, Dr. Vaughn noted that the behavior suggests a dynamic often seen in structured criminal conspiracies. In his analysis, one individual typically handles the local logistics, the surveillance, the funding, and the escape vehicles, while another executes the physical act. Now here's where things get complicated. If Albright was handling the infrastructure, it implies a level of premeditation that requires a clear motive. Yet local property records show no historical ties between Albright and the Guthrie family. Then there is this detail from the handwriting analysis of the notebook found in Albright's desk drawer. Preliminary findings released by the state's forensic document examiner indicate that the logs detailing Nancy Guthrie's daily habits were written by two distinct individuals. The first section, which maps out the neighborhood security camera blind spots, reportedly matches known samples of Robert Vance's handwriting. The second section, which notes the specific times Guthrie's mail was delivered and when her lawn care service arrived, shows structural characteristics highly consistent with Albright's penmanship. This suggests that the surveillance notebook was a shared document passed back and forth between Vance and Albright as they compiled intelligence on their target. Furthermore, investigators say that a secondary search of Albright's financial records revealed a series of small cash deposits made into her account throughout the summer of 2025, totaling nearly $12,000. These deposits were always made in amounts under $2,000. A pattern that financial analysts say is commonly used to avoid triggering automatic bank reporting thresholds to federal regulators. The source of this cash remains unknown, raising the critical question of whether Vance and Albright were being funded by a third party whose identity has not yet been uncovered. As the tension between the physical evidence and the defense's statements grows, local authorities in Pima County are facing increasing pressure to explain why these cross-state connections were missed during the initial weeks following Vance's arrest. For 8 months, the public was led to believe the threat was entirely neutralized, while a critical co-conspirator allegedly remained free in Arizona, with full access to the primary vehicle and digital evidence tied to the crime. Martha Albright's upcoming extradition hearing in Phoenix is expected to shed more light on these gaps, as prosecutors prepare to present the full scope of the telematics and financial evidence to a federal judge. When we look at the entire collection of evidence assembled by the federal task force over the past week, the chaotic fragments of the Nancy Guthrie case begin to take a very clear, logical shape. For nearly 8 months, the public was left with a deeply incomplete understanding of what happened, distracted by a narrative that limited the crime to a single motel room in Nevada. But the arrest of Martha Albright at her home on Main Street in Mesa, Arizona, bridges the structural gaps that previously puzzled investigators. When you combine the financial ledgers from Wells Fargo, the cellular tower data from the night of October 12, the handwritten surveillance notebook, and the background telematics from the gray Chevrolet Malibu, you are no longer looking at an isolated, spontaneous crime. Instead, you see a systematic operation. The evidence suggests that Robert Vance was simply the individual who executed the physical crime on the ground. However, his personal financial records prove he did not possess the independent means to plan, fund, or sustain an operation that stretched across multiple state lines. Martha Albright's bank accounts provided the necessary capital, her registered vehicle provided the physical transit, and the shared notebook provided the exact vulnerabilities of the target. But there is a major problem that still lingers at the absolute center of this case, and it involves the question of ultimate responsibility. According to federal investigators, while the logistical connection between Vance and Albright is now firmly established by physical evidence, the origin of the $12,000 in structured cash deposits remains the true key to this entire mystery. Public financial records indicate that Albright's legitimate income consisted entirely of a modest monthly pension from her years as an administrative assistant at the Maricopa County School District. She had no independent investments or large-scale savings that could account for sudden influxes of cash throughout the summer of 2025. The small, repetitive nature of those cash deposits, always resting just under the $2,000 mark, suggests that someone with a sophisticated understanding of banking regulations was feeding funds to Albright. This pattern is designed specifically to avoid triggering an automatic currency transaction report, which banks are legally required to file with the federal government for transactions exceeding $10,000. This points investigators toward a highly logical conclusion. While Robert Vance and Martha Albright were the visible operators on the ground, they were likely working at the behest of a third party who is yet to be formally named in the public court documents. Now here's where things get complicated. If there is a third individual directing this operation from the shadows, the motive for targeting Nancy Guthrie changes entirely. Local detectives initially looked for personal grievances or local connections in Tucson, finding absolutely none. But if the funding came from an outside source, investigators must look beyond personal animosity and focus heavily on financial or legal leverage. Then there is this detail regarding the specific items found inside the notebook seized from the Mesa residence. Tucked into the back sleeve of the notebook, federal agents recovered a photocopied page from a civil law directory, specifically highlighting the names of estate planning attorneys based in Pima County. Next to one prominent firm name, a handwritten note simply read, "Trust documents finalized November 2024. This indicates that whoever was compiling this information was not just tracking Nancy Guthrie's physical movements around her neighborhood. They were actively researching her legal and financial affairs. For an older woman living quietly on a fixed income, the revelation that her private estate details were being examined across state lines adds a deeply unsettling dimension to her disappearance. It suggests that the kidnapping was not the end goal of this conspiracy, but rather a tool to exert pressure on a larger family structure or an asset pool. As the legal process moves forward into the federal court system, we are beginning to see how these individual pieces of digital and physical evidence will fit into a larger prosecution strategy. The initial lone wolf theory presented by local police in October 2025 has been completely dismantled by the facts entering the record today. Prosecutors are currently using these bank ledgers and cell phone pings to construct a racketeering and conspiracy case that makes it very difficult for either Vance or Albright to claim ignorance. The defense team for Martha Albright faces a significant challenge as the extradition paperwork is processed in Phoenix. To argue that she was an innocent bystander who merely lent a car to an acquaintance becomes nearly impossible when confronted with her own handwriting detailing the schedules of the Guthrie household. The physical reality of the evidence forces a choice. Either she must prepare to face a lengthy federal prison sentence for conspiracy, or she must cooperate with the FBI to identify the individual who was supplying the structured cash deposits throughout 2025. With this broader picture established, the focus of the investigation must naturally shift away from the desert communities of Arizona and toward the financial pathways that set this entire sequence of events into motion. As the federal investigation deepens into Martha Albright's ties to Robert Vance, the true scale of the operation is forcing law enforcement to completely reevaluate the charges. Initially, local authorities treated the case as a localized kidnapping with a rapid, singular resolution. However, the evidence uncovered in Mesa, Arizona, has transformed this file into a complex, multi-state conspiracy case that is now drawing direct involvement from federal prosecutors and specialized divisions within the FBI. To fully understand why this is escalating, we have to look at the specific nature of the federal statutes now being applied. According to legal experts familiar with the matter, when a crime involves crossing state lines, such as transporting a victim, moving vehicles used in a crime, or routing funds through multiple interstate banks, the legal threshold changes significantly. Martha Albright is no longer merely being viewed as a resident who provided a place to stay or a vehicle to borrow. Federal prosecutors are preparing an indictment that frames her as an active partner in an ongoing criminal enterprise. But there is a problem with the idea that this was just a two-person operation. According to a series of unsealed search warrant returns filed in the Federal District Court of Arizona on June 23, 2026, agents discovered a secondary encrypted communication application on Albright's home computer. This software was not utilized to communicate with Robert Vance. Instead, the logs indicate that Albright was receiving direct text-based instructions from an unrecognized user account operating under an encrypted handle. The messages, sent throughout August and September of 2025, detailed exact drop-off locations for the cash deposits we discussed previously, as well as instructions on when to purchase the burner phones. This discovery introduces a completely new layer of complication to the case. Investigators say the metadata from these encrypted chats shows that the individual directing Albright was highly knowledgeable about law enforcement tracking capabilities. The user routinely instructed Albright to power down her devices before driving to specific financial institutions, a technique designed to prevent cellular tower mapping from establishing a pattern of travel. Now here's where things get complicated. If Albright was taking orders from a third individual, it shifts our understanding of her role. Her defense team's argument that she was simply a vulnerable woman manipulated by Robert Vance becomes much harder to sustain when the physical record shows she was actively managing a separate, highly disciplined line of communication with an entirely different entity. Then there is this detail regarding the physical items found hidden inside the 2018 Chevrolet Malibu. When federal forensic teams disassembled the interior door panels of the vehicle on Tuesday afternoon, they reportedly recovered 3 additional unactivated SIM cards, a roll of commercial-grade surveillance tape, and a printed map of the suburban areas surrounding Tucson. Crucially, the map featured hand-drawn circles around specific public utility hubs and secondary access roads that completely bypass major highway toll systems. According to former investigators who have analyzed these findings, these items indicate that the operation had a built-in contingency plan. The logistics were designed to ensure that even if a primary route was compromised, or if a vehicle was flagged by automated license plate readers, alternative paths into the remote areas of the desert had already been scouted and mapped out. This level of preparation is precisely why the behavioral analysis teams are focusing heavily on the timeline leading up to October 12. Spontaneous crimes do not typically involve hidden compartments, pre-scouted escape routes, or structured bank accounts managed by multiple parties across hundreds of miles. Every piece of evidence entering the public record suggests a deliberate, methodical process where every asset was placed with a specific purpose in mind. Furthermore, federal agencies are looking deeply at how these institutions, the communication networks, the car rental structures, and the digital privacy apps were exploited. Prosecutors have issued a new round of subpoenas targeting the encrypted platform's parent company, demanding access to IP routing logs associated with the anonymous handle. Federal law enforcement officials state that their priority is tracking down the digital origin point of these commands, indicating that the Mesa, Arizona arrest is not the final phase of this operation, but rather a doorway into a much larger network. As the federal grand jury in Phoenix prepares to hear testimony from the financial analysts and digital forensics experts next week, the pressure on Martha Albright is mounting. Legal observers note that in cases of this magnitude, federal prosecutors often present the full weight of the technical evidence early in the process to encourage a co-conspirator to cooperate. Whether Albright will choose to break her silence and identify the source of the encrypted messages remains the most critical variable in the entire investigation. With the legal framework shifting toward a wider conspiracy, the focus now turns toward identifying the digital origins of those instructions, a task that is currently taking federal cyber units deep into server logs, stretching far beyond the borders of Arizona. The discovery of the encrypted application on Martha Albright's computer forces a final, deeply unsettling realization about the timeline of this case. For months, our collective understanding rested entirely on the actions of the people we could physically see. Robert Vance traveling across state lines, and Martha Albright managing vehicles and cash deposits in Mesa. But the digital data reveals that the true architect of the crime may have never set foot near the Guthrie residence or the properties in Arizona. According to cybersecurity experts, embedded with the FBI's cyber division, tracing the server logs from the encrypted messages has proven exceptionally difficult. The anonymous user utilized multiple proxy servers located outside the United States to mask their true Internet Protocol address, bouncing signals through networks in Switzerland and Panama. However, investigators say they achieved a breakthrough late yesterday afternoon. A single unmasked login occurred on September 28, 2025, the day before the $12,000 in structured cash began appearing in Albright's bank account. That specific login was traced back to a commercial network provider operating in Chicago, Illinois. But there is a problem with assuming this was a random cybercriminal. According to public court entries, the timing of that specific login directly correlates with a series of highly confidential civil court filings involving assets related to the extended Guthrie estate. Public records indicate that Nancy Guthrie was the primary trustee of a family trust established after her late husband's death in 1988. While local police initially stated there was no known connection between the suspects and the victim, federal financial analysts are now exploring the possibility that the abduction was an attempt to force a specific legal or financial concession regarding that trust. Now here's where things get complicated. If the motive was entirely financial, rooted in an estate dispute, it requires an insider's knowledge of the trust structure. Neither Robert Vance nor Martha Albright had any plausible way of accessing those private civil records. Investigators say this strongly supports the theory that the individual in Chicago was the primary beneficiary of the operation, using Vance and Albright as disposable assets to distance themselves from the physical crime. To expand on this point, financial investigators have spent the last 48 hours tracing the corporate origins of that Chicago IP address. The network footprint belongs to a shell company registered in Delaware called Apex Management Solutions. This entity has no physical offices, no public-facing website, and no listed employees. However, a review of corporate banking filings reveals that Apex Management Solutions received a wire transfer of $40,000 from a private bank account in early August 2025, just weeks before Martha Albright began her localized cash deposits in Arizona. This suggests a highly structured, tiered system of funding designed to create plausible deniability. The true source of the money flows into a blind shell company, which then distributes smaller, untraceable cash amounts to an intermediary like Albright, who finally funds the boots-on-the-ground operator, Robert Vance. By the time the physical crime takes place, the person pulling the strings is separated by 3 distinct layers of financial insulation. Then there is this detail from the Maricopa County Jail, where Martha Albright is currently being held without bond. According to a statement released by the sheriff's office this morning, Albright requested a private meeting with federal prosecutors shortly after the cyber forensics report was submitted to her defense team. While the details of that discussion remain strictly confidential, sources close to the investigation report that Albright has agreed to verify the identity of the individual she believed she was communicating with in exchange for a recommendation of reduced conspiracy charges. This brings us to the end of what we can definitively verify through the public record at this stage of the proceedings. The narrative has traveled from a localized missing persons report in Tucson to a routine arrest in a Nevada motel, through a complex web of digital and financial tracking in Mesa, and now points toward a corporate or legal origin hundreds of miles away. It serves as a stark reminder that modern criminal investigations are rarely contained within the physical boundaries of a single crime scene. The digital footprints we leave behind, whether from a vehicle's computer, a cell phone tower, or a bank ledger, ultimately provide a level of logic and clarity that purely circumstantial stories cannot match. As we conclude this multi-part look at the current state of the investigation, the legal process is just beginning for the individuals involved. The federal grand jury is expected to return a comprehensive indictment within the week, which will likely reveal the true identity of the individual behind the encrypted handle. What aspect of this cross-state network do you find the most surprising? Is it the precision of the digital tracking that eventually exposed the conspiracy, or the realization that the primary actor may have been operating completely from the shadows? If you appreciate this focus on verified details and methodical reporting, please consider subscribing to the channel to ensure you do not miss our coverage when the federal indictments are officially unsealed. Thank you for your time, your thoughtful comments, and your continued support. Please stay safe.